Sparks that I don't remember. Hold and let it shine. Fix and start to fade away. Fix and start to fade away. Fix and start to fade away.
Hello, dear friends of Kabbalah International. We are again with MarioSaban.
Shalom, how are you, Nacho? A pleasure.
Very good, Shalom Mario. We're going to talk about the awakening of consciousness. We wake up and then what?
This is the big question, because nowadays everyone says, well, we need to wake up, we're awakening. But then you see that many people, once they awaken, don't know the work they need to do. Or there are many who believe that awakening is all there is, and no further work is needed. The work begins after waking up. The work is not to wake up. The question is, what do we do after we wake up? That's where the work begins. Because when we awaken to our imperfections, we awaken to reality, we wake up to the imbalances that we have to work on, we awaken to the potential we have that has not yet been developed. It means that when we awaken, we need to start working with what we can now see that we couldn't see before. In other words, there's a difference between the spiritually asleep and the spiritually awake. The spiritually asleep, being asleep, cannot see what they need to do, what they need to correct, so they remain asleep because they can't see what's happening. The one who has awakened sees what he has to correct. They see what they need to study, see what they need to meditate on, see what they need to work on, and they have to get moving. One of the problems with many spiritualities is that they do not have, I would say, a serious program for the post-awakening period, and that many spiritualities also believe that awakening is the goal. For that reason, when a person awakens and then asks, "What do I need to work on?" many of these souls turn to Kabbalah. Because in Kabbalah, what is offered is all the work that needs to be done after the awakening. And understand that one does not awaken once. Each time the level of consciousness increases, it awakens to new realities. This means that I would say we should talk about a continuous awakening, an awakening as a process, not as a final result. It's not that I wake up and the result is already magical. No. I wake up, and tomorrow, if I elevate my level of consciousness, I awaken my consciousness to that new level. Therefore, we are constantly awakening. So the one who has awakened has done so to begin increasing their levels of awakening. And that takes a continuous effort on the part of the person. So of course many people think that spirituality is, I've arrived. No, you haven't arrived anywhere. In fact, you've just started. And every day is a new birth and a new death. I mean, every day is waking up to that new reality, seeing how in that new reality I'm going to grow. And from there, one must be growing at all times, dying to the previous identity. Therefore, it is important to understand that awakening is a work, understand that awakening is a process, understand that awakening does not always involve all dimensions awakening at the same time. Sometimes some dimensions awaken while others do not. There are 4 that awaken and 6 that remain asleep. So, these 4 must awaken the other 6. Sometimes the soul does not awaken all at once. Sometimes it awakens only in one dimension, and that dimension must raise the other 9. Thus, there are all kinds of processes in awakening. It needs to be analyzed deeply. It is not as simple as saying, I have awakened, and we are done.
Certainly, in relation to what you are discussing, it occurred to me that the concept of awakening also implicitly involves the theme of meaning. There is a phrase, well, not a phrase but a concept, that explains Rabbi Shlach, which says that all the spiritual actions we perform are actually simple tools to acquire the ability to care for others, to care for our fellow. Therefore, I believe that in some way this process of awakening is connected to this sense of having an interaction with our environment that is positive, that is caring, that is, let's say, empowering for the well-being of the other.
Of course. When one is well oneself, the well-being of others comes naturally. The problem is that I cannot give welfare to the other if I'm not well. If I am bad, I am not going to give much welfare to the other. So the subject of the neighbor is key, in the sense that the neighbor is the closest I have, and the closest I have is me. It means that the first neighbor is myself. If I can manage to be in tranquility, in inner peace, if I can manage to awaken and rectify myself after awakening, undoubtedly I am already with my own life spreading an activity, a beneficial energy for others. But if I don't manage to be well with myself, it will undoubtedly be very difficult to love others correctly and spread that light outward. It's very difficult to perform tikkun olam when you haven't worked on at least the first phase of your personal tikkun or personal rectification. It seems important to me to be responsible for oneself so that society can later benefit from your growth. Because in the end, the growth of each one of us is for the benefit of society as a whole.
I really like what you said at the beginning, which I later nuanced with that phrase from Schlag. I really appreciate the concept of continuous awakening, which contrasts with these new spiritualities that promote a kind of instant awakening. That is, wake up, 1, 2, 3, boom.
Moreover, the awakening is going to be instantaneous and in a kind of naive happiness. In reality, spiritual ecstasy comes from hard work with oneself and with others. There is no magical way to access it. One achieves it according to the effort one puts in, and this effort will lead to the merit of accessing and connecting to that level. Therefore, while there are certainly many different types of new spiritualities, and it's not possible to generalize, it is clear that some people mistakenly believe that awakening means arriving at a final result. There is no definitive outcome in personal life. There is a continuous process of growth each day to higher levels of consciousness, and this is what truly demonstrates whether one is genuinely in spirituality. Otherwise, what can happen is that many people may believe they are in the spiritual world while actually being stuck in a mental loop. They are in self-deception. There are many self-deceived people. There are people who are fundamentally self-deceived and self-deceived teachers who, due to their high level of self-deception, sometimes lead others who are also self-deceived. So, it's very difficult to get out of the deception. Because to get out of the deception, the only way out of the deception is to try to calibrate our daily work. In my opinion, where the secret lies, mysteriously, is in our daily work. In that everyday work, the ant-like work that is often the least visible, neither to your students, nor on social media, nor to your fellow beings. It is the invisible work that you are slowly doing inside yourself every day. And that work is what gives the final result. That's because you're in the process. You are in the process of growth. The problem is that we live in a world where people want to access this level automatically. Notice, we will do and we will listen, says the text of the Torah, which at the beginning is a very strange commandment, because in reality I always, especially when I was younger, I always wanted to listen first and then do. And then you realize that it actually goes simultaneously. As I see it, you have to do and listen at the same time. What usually happens in our society? That the actions are blocked by self-blocking in general. And why do they remain blocked? They remain blocked due to a mental theory of a fantasy of doing. There is the fantasy of doing and the actual doing. And that is why I often say that everything goes on the blackboard. What is the fantasy of doing? The fantasy of doing is believing that when you think you are already doing. No, you are not. You think, then you have to do. Then you have to bring it down to reality. Sometimes in the spiritual world, there is a kind of theoretical excitement at the intellectual level that leads us to delve into topics. But if it is not integrated, it cannot manifest in reality. Because to go down to reality is to go down to a lot of limitation within Malkuth, within the physical dimension, and people resist going down to the physical dimension, because they take the intellectual as a refuge from the spiritual, and consequently they don't become a practical person. He becomes totally theoretical. Theory is not bad. Theory changes my perception of reality, but then I have to act within reality. That is why the commandment begins, we will do, and we will listen. That is to say, you have to take action. One needs to take action because sometimes so much theory can lead to indulgence. Additionally, too much theory can make me believe in a self-deception stemming from an unbalanced ego, thinking that I am what I think, while not reflecting it in my actions. So, there is a very delicate question, I would say, where we have to go deeper, but at the same time we have to act. What is happening? There are two extremes. There are people who think a lot and do little, and there are people who do a lot but think nothing, or they think little. So, of course, you have to find a balance between Malkuth and Binah. I think while I do. I don't let my thinking paralyze my actions, because otherwise I believe that my thought is deceiving me into thinking that simply by thinking the action will magically happen. I need to bring it down to action. The question is, why don't we bring it down to action? And we do not go down to action because the field of matter is so limited that in action mistakes are made and imperfections are committed. Of course, what happens in matter? You have to be a structural humble, because the structure itself makes you humble because of the limitations of matter itself. On the other hand, in the theoretical world, the ego is enlarged. It walks around quietly in self-deceptions because they do not agree with reality. They do not confront reality. So we must not deceive ourselves by manipulating reality, because in the end, reality will oppose theory sooner or later. In other words, the reality of events will eventually reveal itself in its raw form, regardless of what you think. Therefore it is good, and that's why, notice where Kabbalah starts. Kabbalah begins with understanding how the laws of the universe operate. The big question is, why does Kabbalah start in the cosmogonic? Why doesn't it go directly to the psychological?
Yes.
It starts with the cosmogonic because first, you need to understand what the laws are that you must accept, given that you are situated within this world governed by these laws. Only after accepting these laws can you then see what you will do. Of course, first we start with the cosmogonical to make an acceptance of reality. And when we accept the cosmogonic reality, as closely as possible to our imperfection, we should aim for that imperfect approach. However, that imperfect approach should not be translated into an intellectual fantasy. Therefore, neither intellectual fantasy that renounces the material world, nor materiality without an intellectual perception that can provide interesting strategies within the material realm. In other words, I cannot dismiss theory, because theory is changing my perception and can help me find strategies also within the matter. All of this means that when we reach this point, we are indeed in the process of awakening, because it is not an awakening of theoretical self-deception. It is an awakening that relates to practice.
Thank you, Mario.
Thank you, Nacho.